Hello, my name is Jeff Gostick and I'm going to present to you our work entitled Elucidating the Effects of Gravity when Simulating Drainage in a Porous Media via an Image-Based Porosimetry Method. This work was done in conjunction with Amy Baslak's group at U of T, Paul Schultz's group at University of Mannheim, and my collaborator at Waterloo, Mario Ioannidis. And I'd like to give a shout out to Eric Chadwick and Lucas Hamann, the graduate students who contributed to this work. So motivation and background are as follows. Basically, tomograms are getting larger all the time. Between the ability to stitch images together to make extremely tall images, for instance, you can find a 10,000 voxel tall image on Digital Rock's portal. You can, advanced optics to get images with larger field of view, AI generation of arbitrarily large images that are representative of actual materials. Plasma fib, interesting technique. Technically, it's not tomography, but it does generate a voxel image. Of course, and we also have better CPUs. So all of these things are contributing to our ability to handle larger and larger, or our desire to work with larger and larger images. But our ability to do simulations on them has to stay in pace. So we need to do simulations of multi-phase flow in particular. It's crucial to do to get relative permeabilities and diffusivities and so on. Now, simulating multi-phase displacement remains very slow. So you've got techniques like lattice Boltzmann, volume of fluid, phase field, level set, etc. Those are all computationally quite intensive and prohibitive when the image gets too large. An alternative is to use image-based approaches, which essentially just insert spheres into the image and use the relationship between the curvature of the meniscus and the size of a sphere to decide where to put images, voxels of invading fluid. So can we improve the accuracy of those techniques to accommodate the tall and large images that we anticipate? And that's what this talk is about. Before I get into that, incorporating gravity into these methods, let me just first give a little bit of background on the standard way to do these simulations. So typically you will start with a voxel image, perform a distance transform on that image, where you get color map is the distance from solid. Then you can do a threshold to find all voxels or pixels that are larger than a certain size, which means they can accommodate a meniscus of a certain curvature. Now what we need to do is trim off all of these ones that are disconnected, because even though you can accommodate a large meniscus in there, it doesn't mean fluid can get there because it has to get through small constrictions. So these are not realistic. So here we have a trimmed version, and what's left over and connected to our inlet, you can then dilate to turn it back into blobs of water or fluid with curvature. Now, the approach that we have developed is to incorporate gravity is pretty straightforward. It is as follows. Basically what you do is start by converting the size of the distance transform into a pressure using the Laplace equation, where sigma is the fluid of the system that you're interested in. And that gives you this image here. So instead of this, you notice that the color map is inversed. So instead of looking for sizes that are a certain size or bigger, you look for a capillary pressure, which is the entry pressure for that region that is a certain value or lower. So you can find, okay, find me all of the dark purple regions, and then we'll invade into there. And then once you've done that threshold, then you end up with the same dark gray seed values or core, the surviving voxels, which you can then dilate to make your fluid blobs. However, if you then do the following, you can actually adjust those capillary pressure values in each voxel for the rho GH of the system. So rho G, or delta rho, I should say, is just, it's a fixed value that you can add to each pixel. And H is essentially the height of that pixel from the inlet in the units of whatever you're working in. So if you add this correction to the pressure map, you get this image here. And then everything proceeds as normal. You find all of the regions that are invadable below a certain pressure, which is this case because gravity is making the invasion front very compact. There's only a few locations. And then you find those and dilate them as follows. And I'll just note that when you do the dilation, you have to do it using a sphere insertion. So you can't use like a convolution to do an image dilation, or you can't use the distance transform method. You have to do a dilation based on the radius of the pixel which exists there. So it's a little subtle, but basically because you have a difference in capillary pressure throughout the system from the top to the bottom, you can't just apply one curvature. You got to apply different curvatures over the whole system. So you have to insert the radius of the sphere of the radius of the local size. Now to validate this method, we did a few different things. One of them was to generate images of capillary tubes of different size and to compare the invasion to the calculated amount of capillary rise from the Young-Laplace equation. So here we have our image, and you can see this is the height of the fluid for different size capillaries for given pressure. And this is over here in this graph is comparing those simulated heights to the analytical value. We also did a study here to look at the amount of error to be expected as a function of image resolution. And as the image resolution gets better, more refined, of course, the error gets less. I won't dive into that. You can read our paper, which, by the way, is under review. Hopefully, you'll be able to read it soon. For visual validation, for what it's worth, here is some 2D images of invasion with no gravity effect at 2 different applied pressures, and we have the fluid entering from the bottom, okay, the invading fluid. And the color map you see here, I'll just talk about that for a second. Basically, this is a way to get the entire simulation history all in one image. So each color corresponds to the pressure at which that voxel was invaded. So if you do a threshold of, okay, say for instance, find me all voxels that are 200, a value of 200 or less, you'll maybe end up with these voxels. Okay, then you can find the number of voxels in there, and you can calculate the saturation of your image by looking at the surviving voxels. So you can relate the saturation by counting voxels to the pressure at which the threshold was applied. We'll get to that in a minute when we start talking about capillary pressure curves. Here's the same simulation, everything equal, but with gravity included. You can see the invasion front is very compact compared to this case over here on the left. And at this applied pressure of almost 1,000 pascals, there's still regions that are not invaded compared to the non-gravity case. Same thing in 3D, of course. The image, this process works in 2D and in 3D. And as I mentioned before, the color map in here allows us to threshold the image progressively to go to higher and higher values of the inlet pressure, see which colored voxels survive, count them up, and we can get capillary pressure curves. So here we have capillary pressure curves, the 2D case on the left and the 3D case on the right. So the red line is the standard capillary pressure curve obtained from these images with no gravity, and the blue line is what you would call the pseudo capillary pressure curve, where there's not one capillary pressure existing in the image anymore because the capillary pressure changes with height. So you take the capillary pressure at one datum point. In our case, we always take it at the bottom. And so that's our pseudo capillary pressure that is being applied to the whole system. And you get the curvature, or the curves rather have a more of a gentle slope instead of this sharp rise. So this behavior is expected when you've got gravity effects in play. For another validation, we compared it to some experimental data from the literature. We looked at the paper from Ayaz et al. From last year. They have a micro model where they took 2 plates and they sprinkled 1 millimeter beads between the plates. They filled the whole thing with water, and then they injected air from the top. And they tilted the micro model to adjust the gravity. That's how they controlled the bond number. So their experimental, by the way, so we were able to generate an image that looked pretty similar to their micro model because they did a good job describing the micro model. So this is actually in 3D, okay? So there's a plate above and below the spheres. The spheres are between the plates, and there's like a 3D space that the fluid is flowing into. So we tried to match that as well as we could. Here we have experimental images taken from the paper. So air is pushing in from the top at different capillary pressures or pseudo-capillary pressures. And the bottom row here is our simulations. You can see we're getting the same trends. We've got kind of a compact invasion front, sort of fractal nature there as well. You'll notice that there's more trapped defending phase in the experiment than in our simulations. I'll talk about that in the next slide. That was sort of one thing we weren't able to match very well, but we were able to match the pseudocapillary curves pretty well, as I will show you in a second. So here we have the pseudocapillary curve. On the left is just the straight up saturation. So you can see, the light colored data points is taken from their paper. These darker lines with the white markers is our simulation. So you can see we did not match the trapped saturation. But qualitatively, the trend is correct. So as we go to higher and higher bond numbers, less and less, sorry, I should put the arrow the other way. As we go to higher bond numbers, less trapping occurs, as they saw. It's just the absolute amount is different. If you normalize the simulations by the maximum amount of wetting phase that was invaded, or sorry, non-wetting phase that was invaded, the agreement is actually quite good. All of these lines are more or less falling on top of each other. So with that validation, we then analyzed the algorithm a little further to make sure that it did behave as expected. So for instance, we analyzed the height of the two-phase zone, and we expected that height to vary with the inverse of the bond number. And so what we have here are four saturation profiles for different bond numbers, so 0.01, 0.1, 1, and 10. So as the bond number goes up, you get more and more vertical saturation profiles. This is the domain length here, and this is the saturation on this axis. I'm sorry, the axis title was missing. So low bond number, we've got very wide invasion fronts, lots of ups and downs here in the saturation. At a high bond number, the invasion front is essentially flat. And we analyzed those numbers in a bit more detail and plotted here the height of the two-phase zone versus the inverse bond number on these log-log plots. Now, a few things to note. First of all, there is a region in the middle here where the height of the two-phase zone does in fact vary linearly with the inverse bond number as expected. There's two end cases that need to be looked at. So that is basically once you reach the height of the image, you don't get any two-phase zones that are bigger than that. So there's sort of a plateau here. Now, if the image was larger, this line would continue, indefinitely, as long as your image could accommodate all of the two-phase zone. And then down here, however, it needs a little bit more thought. So you'll notice this is kind of plateauing here at about 10 voxels. This line here is indicating the mean pore size or the characteristic pore size. And so what's happened is that even though the invasion front is essentially as flat as can be, the way that we're invading the fluid is that we're putting spheres in. So the spheres are circular in shape or spherical in shape. They have an arc. So the fringe of this flat invasion front is actually like frilled with the arcs of the meniscus. So the height of the two-phase zone can never be less than the radius of those spheres. So that's why it kind of plateaus at a value here corresponding approximately to the pore size, which is, it's pretty low. I mean, this is voxels. We have a 1,000 tall image and we're talking 10 or even 8 voxels. So it's not a significant effect. It looks significant on a log scale, but it's not really. So that was quite encouraging to see that behavior working. Lastly, we thought it would be worthwhile to generate a kind of a guideline of when you can use this, when you need to. So lastly, we thought it would be useful to generate a bit of a guideline so that you could assess whether gravity should be included in your simulation or not. So here we have the bond number on this axis, domain height on that axis, and the color corresponds to the error. And the error being the difference in the saturation at each vertical position with and without gravity being included. So we injected the image to be 50% global saturation, and then we analyzed each slice, and that's the error that you're seeing here. So if your image is, and we generated a very large image and we looked at each slice, but if your image is not that large, then let's say it's only this tall, 1 millimeter, then you're not up in this area. So you're down here and you're probably in a region of very low error. If your bond number is quite large and your image is short, then maybe you've got some error. If your image happens to become taller, however, you're going to end up perhaps up here where the error can become significant, 10, 20, even 50% difference in the saturation. All right, and so in conclusion, incorporating gravity into the simulations, it proved to be important. Like, the effect was noticeable and significant. It was also quite simple to do just by translating the size into pressures and proceeding from there. The additional processing required was almost no extra cost, so the time to do this was the same as the normal approach, so there's almost no reason not to do it. The results were in very good agreement qualitatively and quantitatively with available literature and expected trends. And the code presented here, as I said, it's under review. Hopefully it will be available soon, but it will eventually be incorporated into PoreSpy, our package that we maintain. It's available on GitHub, and you can find it by going to that website. And lastly, future work, I think this technique can be applied to our recent publication, which was invasion percolation, or image-based invasion percolation, which you can find in computers and geosciences. It should be possible to take this pressure map with the rho GH correction and do the invasion percolation simulation on that image as well, so that you can get the volume-controlled capillary pressure curve, pseudo-capillary pressure curves, actually matching the data from Ayaz et al. That I showed earlier. So we're looking forward to trying that. Okay, and that concludes my talk. Thank you.